Hi, this is Sean. I've studied with Dr. Barry Harris for over 15 years and have fallen in love with these voicings and movements that we learn. But what I'd like to share with you is how I organise it and teach it to my students in a way that's very structured, so hopefully you can get an overview of the system and how to apply it. It is a big subject, you can't apply it just from watching one video, but this will give you a good idea of the structure of it and what it can do. So join me and let's take a look. So first of all, if I ask my students to name the basic chords in jazz, they'll often begin talking about flat fives and sharp 11s and all kinds of stuff. So we need to start from the basic chords, and there are 7 basic chords. They can all be decorated and have voicings and movements and all that stuff, but you can actually play with the 7 basic chords. Once you understand what they are, then you can start to learn the voicings and movement system. These are our 7 basic chords: major 7, minor 7, dominant 7th, minor 7, flat 5. We also get major 6, we get minor 6, and we get diminished. So this video isn't to teach you what the basic chords are. We have to assume that you know that by this level because this is more advanced material. But even if you're not an advanced student yet, you'll start to get the idea of where to go and what to do and where it leads to. These are in no particular order. These are just in the normal order that people tend to call them out, roughly. Okay, so what can we do now that we know our 7 basic chords? Now we can start to learn how to voice these basic chords. And the exciting part is that these voicings come mostly from major 6s and minor 6s put on top of another chord. And actually, very often the last 2 chords that people will call out are major 6 and minor 6. They often don't get talked about enough, and you'll see some fake books, lead sheet books, omit them entirely, and they're not very well understood. But they are actually the most important. So let's see why. Well, if you know what a major 6 chord is and what it does and what it's the same as, then you're going to find it covers quite a lot of the chords on the left at the moment. For example, C major 6 is obviously C major 6. Nothing new here, okay? But we've already covered the major 6 on the left. But C major 6 is also A minor 7. So if you invert C major 6, you get A minor 7. And even if you don't invert it, it's still A minor 7. So now we've covered major 6 chords, we've covered minor 7th chords just by knowing C6. We'll see what we do with all this in a minute. And the other thing is, if you put C6 on top of an F, then you're going to get a voicing for F major 7, where the 1 of F major 7 has been moved up to 2. Let's see that in its root position. There's F major 7. If you move the 1 up to 2, you get a voicing. Yes, I know people may have said to you, well, that's F major 9 and whatever. Bear with me, because there's another way to see chords. It's not wrong to say it's F major 9, but in this lesson, we're looking at how to get way beyond that level of thinking. So we've also covered major 7ths. So we've covered, out of 7 basic chords, we've covered 3 out of 7, almost half, just by knowing C major 6. So what are the implications for that? Well, the implications become, just in simple terms, if you're learning your inversions, well, if you can invert C6 chords, then already you have inversions for A minor 7 and inversions for the voicing for F major 7. Just at a very simple level. These come in very useful for a ton of reasons. So already the work itself has been cut into 3, right? So you only need to know about C major 6. Okay, let's also see how C minor 6 works. So if we take C minor 6, obviously it's a minor 6. By the way, did you notice when we did the initial group, the bass notes went like this: C, then A, then F, all with a C6 on top. Same thing is going to happen when we do the minor 6s. So we've got C minor 6. Then, if we invert C minor 6, or just move the bass note, we get A minor 7 flat 5. So we've covered minor 7 flat 5 chords as well from C minor 6. If we put those above, this time not F major 7 but F7 shells like this, Then we get an F7. Now this is where a voicing has happened because this F has been moved up a whole step this time. So normally people will say, well, that's F9. Okay, that's fine. But knowing that it's C minor 6 over F will give you a ton more possibilities. And this, as a bonus, can also go over the tritone of F, which is 1, 2, 3 tones away, B7. So let's put the C minor 6 over that as well, and we get a different chord, okay? Now, just by knowing a major 6 and a minor 6, we have uncovered 7 of the 8 chords. We'll talk about why we haven't covered diminished in a minute. Just knowing that itself is quite empowering because actually your voicings and inversions all get taken care of a lot easier than learning all these as separate things. All you've really got to start learning is how these different bass notes correspond to major 6s and minor 6s, okay, how they fit together. So why would you want to bother doing this in the first place? Why not just pick up a jazz book that starts talking about F9s and B7s with flat 9s and sharp 5s and C13s and all that stuff? Isn't that better? Does that give you sexier notes to play? Well, that's okay, but what I say to my students is who've done that at jazz universities and stuff like that is if you go down that route and insist on staying there, that's fine, but I can only actually show you about 20% of what I'm doing. Whereas if you learn these major 6 and minor 6s, you can begin making movements, and those movements will give you all of those possibilities you're already talking about with all the extra notes, but we don't have to actually name all those 11s and sharp 11s and flat 13s and sharp 9s and all that stuff. But it will also give you a ton of possibilities that you won't get with just the long chord names. This does go beyond the scope of this lesson, and we'll obviously have other lessons about this. I already have one on the C major 6 movements, which I'll link somewhere up here or down there in the description. Have a look for it. But what happens is, just as a quick introduction, we take C major 6 and we put in the D diminished chord with it. Okay, so our scale becomes like this, a C6 plus a D diminished. So it's actually like the C major scale with this added A flat, right? And by doing that, on the first degree of it, if we play alternate notes, we get a C major 6. And then if we do that on the second degree, we'll get a D diminished. And fortunately, that's all we get, because when we go from the third degree, we're going to get another C6. And then if I just keep going, we'll get F diminished, which is the same as D diminished. And this just keeps going on. C6, D diminished, C6, D diminished, and C6. So here's a quick taste of so what? Why, not the song So What, but why you would want to do that. Well, C6, if we have, let's say, Embraceable You in the key of C. It's normally in a different key, but just for illustration. Something like that. Maybe I'll just move the top couple of notes this time. This is different now because the chord changes, but still movements, right? This is a different major 6 scale. This is F6, and F6 corresponds to D minor 7. See if I take a D minor 7 and just invert it up, there's my F6. So the F6 movements will be like this. And then a different scale. So you see, you start getting movements immediately. And notice that in the beginning we did a basic one where all the chord notes move, and then we did one where just the top couple of notes move. So that's on C6, but also we did a minor 7 version. We did D minor 7, which if I invert it you can see is F6. So if I know the F6 movements, then they apply to the D minor 7. And that's how it starts to work. You learn your major 6s and minor 6s and their movements, and suddenly you get everything they talk about in the jazz books, but much more, without having to just learn long chord names. And there's nothing particularly wrong with the long chord names, except for it's very restrictive, because you never seem to get movement. For example, lots of people play this sort of sound, but they may not go, there's no movement in it, right? Now you might be wondering, what about all those green minor ones? Well, the first thing I would say is this is a big study, okay? It takes time. You need to get good at just one thing. I would get good at just the major 6 with its diminished, applications to say A minor 7 before a D7, that kind of thing. Any D7 for now. But just in the interests of giving you some completeness here, C minor 6 has almost the same, well, it has the same structure, but almost the same scale as the major 6, because if you take the C major 6 with the D diminished, that gives us a scale as we looked at. If you just flat the 3, you get C minor 6 with the same D diminished. And that's the scale of chords. So there's C minor 6. Let's superimpose that D diminished on top, and that's your scale. So the actual scale would be like this. Okay, so as I said, big subject, but let's see. C minor 6 movement. Let's say you've got an introduction in C minor. See, this is contrary motion. When that goes up, this left goes down. That kind of stuff, right? Let's say that you want to play a dominant movement. C minor 6 goes over F7. So this time what I'm going to do, let me invert my C minor 6 down here. And I'm going to take just some diminished notes. So let's take this A and C up to diminished notes. What do I mean by that? Well, these are the minor notes and these are the diminished notes. These are the minor notes in a different inversion. These are the diminished notes, B diminished. So if I want to take this A and C up to diminished notes, they'd go up here, right? To B and D. There's movement. Yes, a lot of people say that's an F13 with a sharp 11. Okay, but is that going to move? Let's say if I move those same 2 notes back to their minors, diminished notes, minor notes, down to diminished notes here, because the diminished notes were all here, weren't they? D diminished. Now I've got movement like this. That could be an F7. That could be an A minor 7 flat 5 before a D7. It could be C minor 6. It could even be B7. This is more advanced, but F7 and its tritone friend, tritone, 1 tone, 2 tones, 3 tones, tritone, B7, can also have those sorts of C minor 6 movements on it. So that's an introduction into the minors. Here's why we didn't cover diminished in that initial list, because when you take the C major 6 and diminished to make a scale of chords, and you can do that with C minor 6 and the same D diminished, you get a diminished in both. And that's one way to move a diminished chord. There are other ways as well, but that's one really powerful way. So if you had a tune, for example, that starts on C major, but has a G7 beforehand, because G7 leads to C major, a tune like, let's say, There Is No Greater Love. Now you've got the diminished chord in the C major 6 diminished, moving to C6, another diminished, and back. So the beginning of that tune could be something like, see, that's 2 notes, 2 diminished notes, moving in contrary motion through the scale to 3 major notes. These are major notes. And then to 4 diminished notes. So actually when you have a diminished or a dominant sometimes, you can make those sorts of movements as well. I know it's, as I said, it's a pretty deep subject, but this is an overview of why we put so much emphasis on major 6s and minor 6s, because pretty much all the chords we play can come from them as kind of parents. and we can use them to build voicings, we can use them to build movements. So that's a quick overview of how to get into this system, learning major sixes and minor sixes and which other chords they correspond to. I already have a lesson that you can watch on the major six diminished movements and their applications, which will get you started. So I hope that was helpful for you and helps you to organize your learning of voicings and movements. This is exactly the type of stuff I do with intermediate and advanced students, one-to-one, and on jazz skills. So go and have a look and see if there's something there for you. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.